Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for 17 years. I'm a mother and a teacher and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining us and I hope you enjoy the show. Hong Kong Confidential is brought to you by Teresa's Turkish Towels. Teresa imports the finest 100% Turkish cotton towels that dry very quickly, making them perfect for Hong Kong's humid climate. Say goodbye to the traditional smelly and stinky towels and try the colourful and fresh selections available online or in Teresa's Wan Chai store. Use the promo code CONFIDENTIAL online or mention this podcast when you visit in person to receive $100 off your entire order when you order 2 or more towels. With 100% satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, the only thing you've got to lose are the musty smells that permeate traditional terry towels. Visit www.hkturkish.com in order to get the address and directions to Teresa's semi-hidden location. Today I'm here with Viv McGrath. Hi Viv, thanks for meeting with me today.
I'm really pleased to be here, thank you.
Viv, can you just give me a little bit of background in your journalistic career?
Yeah, I'm a television executive producer and everyone says, what is an executive producer? Basically, I make documentaries for British, Australian and American broadcasters. And as executive producer, I suppose the best way of describing it is I'm responsible for everything from the editorial side, the story side, to the financial side. So the buck stops with me on all fronts.
And are you doing that based in Hong Kong now?
Well, I do it based in Hong Kong. I happen to live here, but actually I just work all over the world.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah,
that's great. Do you fly around and work in Australia or in England or wherever you need it?
Yeah, wherever the projects take me. I'm really picking and choosing my projects now because I'm also doing all my other stuff that we'll, I'm sure, talk about in a minute. And so I'm sort of really doing about 6 months to 8 months of the year working on TV stuff, and the other time I'm doing self-projects.
And how did you find yourself living in Hong Kong then?
Well, we've been here twice, actually, and the first time my husband was offered an amazing opportunity here, and I'd always had this dream of being a foreign correspondent because I watched all the Australian cameramen like Neil Davis, really famous ones in the Vietnam War. But later when I became passionate about journalism, I'd see this footage and it just made me think, I want to make a difference. I want to be there and I want to do something. So I always harboured this dream. And I just got this amazing job on a very high-profile news and current affairs show called The Investigators in Australia. And my husband said, well, you can't give that up. And I said, you're kidding me? I've always wanted to be a foreign correspondent. So we just came here. I didn't know anybody, but I created this role as the Channel 7 foreign correspondent, and I did that for many, many years.
Oh, so you started reporting out of Hong Kong for Channel 7 in Australia?
I did.
Oh, how cool.
Vivian McGrath in Vietnam for 7 Nightly News.
Nice.
Yeah, that was an incredible 8 years covering all over Asia, and we did some amazing stories. So we sort of came from my husband, but I then, as we know, Hong Kong, if you can make it in Hong Kong, like New York, you can make it anywhere. And I absolutely made it what I wanted to make it.
And so many of us come for just a couple of years and find ourselves here 20 years later. That's certainly what I did.
Well, we've come here 20 years later, come back. We then went to UK and then Shanghai, and we've now come back again. And it was, again, for my husband's work, but I was just like, without a second thought, because I love Hong Kong. It just is my home. And our children grew up here, so it's a very, very special place in our heart.
You wrote a book called The Unbeatable, How I Left a Violent Man. Tell me about that.
Well, yeah, that's been a long time coming. I've been telling other people's stories for decades as a documentary producer. And I've always wanted to tell my own story, but it's never been the right time. And that story is that I'm a survivor of domestic violence. And it was really serious, you know. It culminated when I was 7.5 months pregnant and age 21 or 2, I think. My ex almost murdered me. He strangled me. I honestly thought I was going to die on that day. I can't even even now, if I start talking about it, I can write about it, but if I start talking about it, I find it really, really difficult.
So do you have quite a visceral reaction?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how you can carry that on for years and years later, isn't it?
So that is what happened to me. And it's quite incredible because a lot of my closest colleagues and friends didn't even know this story about me. And it was a woman called Rosie Batty in Australia who her ex brutally murdered her son very publicly in front of his friends, in front of the friend's parents, in front of her. And then the ex sort of ran towards the police and he was shot. So it was murder-suicide. And she stood, I'm not sure how, it might have been the next morning, but she suddenly came out and spoke. And everybody thought that it was a friend of the family, but she spoke and she said these words that were so incredible. She said, anyone can be the face of family violence. It doesn't matter how nice your house is, how intelligent you are. Anyone can be a victim, and I'm here to attest to that. And I remember hearing that, and I got chills, and I said to my husband, now's the time to tell my story. And sadly, I mean, she was made Australian of the Year in 2015, and she's become incredibly high profile. Any Australian would know her. Sadly, it's because she's white and middle class that people are now listening. And I thought, well, I'm the same. You know, I can speak. I know how to tell a story because I've been doing that for a long time. And I can add my voice to hers because, you know, it's going to take a lot of Rosie Batties to make a difference. She's making an enormous difference. But I thought I wanted to write this story. So basically, my book, Unbeatable, How I Left a Violent Man, it's my memoir, but it's basically talking about how I'm not defined by that incident in my life. I'm not a domestic violence victim. I'm a survivor. And how I turned my life around so completely from being a young single mother to becoming a very successful television producer to going on to find a beautiful, healthy relationship with my husband I'm with now. 30 years on, this year is our wedding anniversary.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, and so there is life after abuse, and I just want to give people hope that there is life after. And so although it's a memoir, but it's also looking at how the fact that even I, who hasn't come from a violent past, there's no history of that, very happy childhood, there are just dysfunctional things in families that get passed down. And, you know, domestic abuse is not something that happens in isolation. It's a cycle that passes down generations. And unless you break that cycle, you will continue to enable that to happen. And so really it's also about where it came from, how I got into that, and how I broke that cycle and did not pass it down to my son. And we had another child, so our 2 children. And they've grown up to be, you know, men who I'm so proud of, who are really respectful of women, who are very well adjusted and champion women.
And that's brilliant. And do you feel like you broke that cycle by talking about it, by showing them good role models and by just really teaching them about respect and equality and all that sort of stuff as they grew up?
No, I didn't do that. I just led by example. And once you learn much more healthy ways of behaving and the dynamics of what makes a healthy relationship, they could then see that in my relationship with my husband. They could see how he treated me, you know, that I no longer accepted somebody who treated me less than worthy. And so they could see a man who treated me with respect. They could see that I treated him with respect.
How long were you in a domestic violent relationship for?
I'd say it was about 4.5 to 5 years.
Wow, that's a long time. So you had 2 children with this man?
No, I met him and fell pregnant, was almost killed by him, still went on to marry him. This is how complicated. We can talk about that, I'm sure, in a minute. And then left initially when my baby was 8 weeks old, and then for good when my baby was about 1. So it was a very, very long and difficult journey.
And I can imagine that's so crazy to be leaving someone with an 8-week-old baby. That's so young, isn't it? You know, your hormones are still crazy. You were young. Yeah. And then, so obviously you went back again and then didn't finally leave till the baby was 1.
On average, it takes a woman or man, because men can be victims as well, 7 times to leave an abusive relationship. They are so pervasive and very complex. And it's, I think, the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life was leaving a violent man and leaving an abusive relationship. You never know the strength you have until you do that. And I really understand now, and this is another purpose for writing my book, I really understand now the answer to that question that everybody asks: why do women stay? And, it's an easy question to ask, and I understand why people ask it if you've never been through it. But if you've been through it, I now understand how hard it is and why we don't leave. And so many, actually. I'm writing a blog now as well, and I've got people writing to me from all over the world now. And the amount of people who ask me, am I even in an abusive relationship, is astonishing.
What do you think qualifies an abusive relationship?
Well, it doesn't happen immediately. I didn't fall in love with a violent, abusive guy. I fell in love with a guy who was extremely charismatic and gorgeous and charming and the life of the party, and everybody loved him. He was a very well-known television actor, actually. And, nobody would have guessed. I fell in love with a guy who was all of that, who happened to later turn violent. What happens is you get hooked in by this very, very charismatic person, and they are very good at spotting something in you that is vulnerable, and probably you're someone that's easier to manipulate. And so they get you into this sort of dysfunctional dance where they start to test your boundaries to see whether they can push them or not. And that is the beginning of what is known as emotional abuse and coercive control. And some people never ever go on to violence. Emotionally abusive people can, but not always. And sometimes the emotional abuse is what confuses people. It's really, really hard to detect. So it's things like manipulative tactics. So you meet them, they're very charismatic. You get wooed into being told, you're the only one for me, you're wonderful. They put you on this pedestal, you feel amazing. And they know what you need to hear because they've detected in you, usually, what I didn't realise until later, a lack of self-esteem or a void in you that makes you feel you're not good enough. And they feel that by making you feel amazing, special, and wanted. And then when they have that security that they've got you, they then start to show you this tiny glimmer of a darker side. But it will be so quick that you don't even notice it. So it will be like a flash of anger, and then it's gone.
Yeah, being rude to a waiter or something like that.
Yeah, very quickly it's gone. Or they might sort of just push you a little bit roughly, or something like that. Then it's gone. And then, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. I didn't mean that. That's not me. So you just think, oh, was I imagining that? Did that actually happen? Or maybe I'm thinking it was worse than it was. So they test your boundaries, and if you don't walk away or you don't challenge them, they'll try something else, and they'll try something else. And it gets a little bit more, a little bit more, and a little bit more. And then when you start to see the sort of things that are a little bit more abusive towards you, then they'll start to do things like gaslighting, which is if you question their behaviour and say, look, I didn't like what you did when you did that. Oh, you're exaggerating it. That didn't happen. You're making it up. You're imagining it. It's that sort of thing that you get told. And they need you to accept the blame for them. Or they'll use mirroring, where they'll project onto you. They'll accuse you of lying when they're the one who's lying. Or they'll do this switch where if you're suspecting they're being unfaithful and you're looking through their phone because you are starting to see signs of this, well, then it will become you're the one who's not trusting. You're the one who's behaving badly for dare looking at their phone. Or they'll just switch it onto you. There's many, many, many different tactics. Or they'll just use blanket statements like saying, oh, so you're the perfect one now. You know, this sort of thing. You end up having to defend yourself. No, I'm not. I wasn't saying that. Or they'll just put smoke bombs up where if you question their behaviour, they'll get you into this circular conversation that is just nuts. 1 minute you're making this benign comment. The next minute they're questioning about your family, your friends, your beliefs, your value system, everything you've ever believed in your entire life. Anything other than the fact that it was about you questioning the fact that they have behaved badly. So all of these manipulative tactics are very subtle, but as they drip them over time, you start to question yourself, you start to doubt yourself, your self-esteem starts to get whittled away, and more importantly, you stop trusting your gut And even though you have these warning signs there, you mistrust them.
Do you think that's something that's harder to do when you're young? Do you think we're better at it when we're older, trusting our instincts and our guts, and when we're young it's not so easy because we're not really in tune with it?
I would say for me, yes, definitely. I am now very good at that. I've got it back. But no, I don't think necessarily, because I have a lot of older people writing to me and they have lost that ability. I think what it is it all comes down to self-esteem. And I thought I was the strong one. I was always the strong one, the confident one, the life of the party. My friends even say to me now, you were always the strong one. And the biggest thing I had to learn was when I realized that this relationship was abusive, and by this point, it was getting violent and all that, I had to question myself. Why did I stay when other people didn't? And this is not to victim blame, but I thought, well, there has to be something in me that didn't walk away. Those warning signs were there. I saw them all, and I just ignored them. And I worked out that what it was I had really deep-seated insecurities, and I had a low self-esteem, even though outwardly I was very bolshy and I covered all that up. I wasn't even aware I was low in self-esteem and insecure when I was young. I can see it now. But that meant that I wasn't good at saying no. I was afraid of confrontation. I was afraid of saying no, and I was very frightened of setting boundaries. So when anyone pushed through those boundaries, I just didn't stand firm against them. And I think that has a lot to do with why you start to mistrust your guts, because if you're low in self-esteem and you get told enough you're wrong, that didn't happen, you're exaggerating, you start to believe them. And I started to believe him. So over time, my gut got less and less protective of me.
Yeah, and do you think there's also an element of you believing that you can change them or fix them?
Oh, very much. Yes, that's a really good point. And a lot of us who are like that also have an enormous amount of empathy. Narcissists and abusive people are attracted to the type of us who I've said are very low in self-esteem, are not good at setting boundaries, and we also have a huge amount of empathy. And we're the sort of types who want to rescue people and save them. Now, narcissists, on the other hand, although deep down they're very insecure and lacking self-esteem as well, even though outwardly they're arrogant, have a self-inflated ego and all that sort of stuff, they have no empathy at all. They have zero idea of the implications of their actions on others. They will not take accountability for their own behaviour. They need somebody else to blame and to put that onto. Who better than someone who's going to come and rescue them? Now, what they do is they can subliminally recognise that you're that person. So my ex saw that I was that type of person. And so when they start to reveal that sort of damaged person inside them, they also trigger in us that need to be needed, need to rescue them, and that makes you feel really good. When you have that void of feeling not good enough, suddenly you're needed by this person. And what happens is you start to think that they've got these two sides. And you see the Dr. Jekyll, the good, lovely, charming, charismatic side, and suddenly there's this nasty side, Mr. Hyde. You're thinking, where's this come from? And the biggest mistake you make is you don't think that they're accountable for Mr. Hyde, because they've blamed you for him, going, well, I was angry because you upset me, or you did this, or you did that. And so you start to think, oh, okay, if I can change my behaviour, then Mr. Hyde's going to go away. I can change them and I can bring the nice Dr. Jekyll back all the time. So they fool you into thinking they've got these two sides, and all you've got to do is take responsibility and you start changing your behaviour instead of making them accountable for theirs. And if you do that and prove to them you're good enough, worthy of them enough, lovable enough, then it will stop. And that's the lie. So you spend your life waiting and hoping for them to change.
And that's exactly why women don't leave after the first time they're hit or after the first sign of domestic violence, because this pattern keeps repeating and they keep believing that either they're responsible or that the person is going to change if they just shift the way that they respond. And also, the abuser is very good at the apology and the makeup and the, oh, I'm so sorry, I won't do it again, and all the promises. I mean, I've had 2 domestic violent relationships in my 20s.
Really?
So what you're talking about resonates so clearly with me, absolutely spot on, and I think we're very similar in personality. And I can see what you've said is exactly how my domestic violent relationships played out.
Well, that's another manipulative tactic. Hoovering is what they call it. And it's such a beautiful word because they suck you back in with their promises to change and their remorse. But there's another more complex aspect to this, and that is that we also form an unhealthy addiction for them. So you're sucked in by that beautiful, charming, charismatic person, and they make you feel great because you are insecure or lacking self-esteem or whatever it is that you need filled, that void, and you're not good at setting boundaries and all that. What happens is when you get that cycle, as you say, you get the gorgeous side, then the nasty, then the gorgeous side, then the nasty, then the gorgeous side, then the nasty. You start to get this craving and addiction because with every cycle, they're whittling away your self-esteem even further. And as a result, you desperately crave the good side to come back to tell you they love you again, they need you again. And in a very dysfunctional way, and like a drug addict, the very thing you're craving and need to make you feel good again is the person who's hurting you.
Because what you want comes after the violence. So you've got to have the violence to have that loving, I'm sorry, let's make up, all of that sort of stuff, and that affirming you.
Yeah.
It's so interesting.
It's a very, very pervasive dynamic. And the pull, I cannot describe that pull towards them. That, even though you are being abused by them, you still love them. You didn't go into this relationship because they were an abuser. You went into this relationship because you loved them. They later turned into that. But as the highs get higher and the lows fewer and further between, you are chasing that high even harder and you need it even more to make you feel good. And that's why it's so difficult to leave, because you're locked into this very unhealthy, addicted dynamic. And they call it codependency because you are addicted to a person who is unavailable emotionally to you in a healthy, normal way. And often they have their own addictions to alcohol or drugs or other things. So it is a very screwed up dynamic. It is not healthy and it is not love either. It is all about control.
It is so much about power and control. And also, do you think that the violence generally escalates? So your level of fear grows and that sort of, you need almost that fear to build until you realise that you're in danger and you've got to get out? I mean, what was it when your baby was 8 months old that triggered you to leave that first time?
8 weeks, actually.
Oh, sorry.
No,
yeah, 8 weeks.
It was an extreme episode of violence. And it was my son that saved me.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, is it because you had a baby and the nurturing, protective mother in you wanted to save the baby?
My child saved my life. I suddenly realised I had many turning points along the way. One of them was when I realised that I'm going to not only bring this child up in a violent home, but he will probably end up repeating that pattern and becoming violent himself or ending up in a violent relationship.
That's interesting that you were able to realise that early in your life at only 21. And,
I started to get support from Al-Anon, which is for wives and families and friends of alcoholics. And you can go to any support group. That happened to be the support group that helped me, and it made me really start to look at what was happening. And that was the major turning point. But even then, I still went back.
Did you know your partner was an alcoholic?
I believed he was and is. I don't know what he's doing now, really, but I believed he was. That's my opinion. Whether he believes he is or not, I don't know.
How did you know to seek out that kind of support?
Do you know what? I don't even remember. I remember somebody mentioning it to me and I ignored it for years. And I've got a lot of mantras One of them I live by is when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And there's been moments in my life where somebody's just said something like that to me, and I wasn't ready to hear it, but it was somewhere in the back of my head, and when I needed it, I walked through those doors.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Really, it was my child that saved me.
And then you came back.
Yes. I also knew what he could do to me because he did almost kill me. So the fear was there, and I did always know that could happen. You know, it does escalate. Emotional abuse escalates. And if anyone listening is seeing any signs of emotional abuse, which is also known as coercive control, and in the UK is actually now deemed a crime, that's all those gaslighting tactics, the mirroring onto you, the hoovering you, sucking you, all those sort
Making
of
you
things.
think you're crazy.
Yeah, those sort of things. That is abusive, and it doesn't necessarily have to escalate, but if you're hearing any verbal threats, like if I can't have you, no one can, well, then they are telegraphing to you that they have the capability or the possibility of killing you. You need to take this stuff very, very seriously. If there's any physical abuse and that starts to escalate, well, then I would absolutely take that extremely seriously because it does escalate. And 2 to 3 women every week are murdered by their partner or ex-partner. And I learnt later, which absolutely terrified me, if you've ever been strangled like I was, the odds of being killed goes up 750%. I'm actually
lucky to be here. How did you get out of that situation?
The leaving process was over a long period of time. I had to really start to understand that he was that Jekyll and Hyde and that actually he was responsible for both sides of that, and stop taking responsibility and the blame for his behaviour, starting to realise he has to be accountable for that. The other thing I learned that was beautiful was somebody said to me the serenity prayer. I'm not religious, but it was an incredible thing for me. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, I had to realise I had to accept I couldn't change him.
And that's the thing. That is the key, I think, isn't it? For women to understand they cannot change them, so therefore they've got to change their situation.
Yes.
We are all only responsible for our own feelings and our own situations, aren't we?
Yes.
So we really need to get out.
Yes.
And how did we have this wisdom at 21 and 23? I was 23 with a 10-month-old baby when I left my violent husband.
Really? You're kidding.
And you know, the thing that I've actually said this in episode 11, Under Control, but the thing that actually helped me to go the most was my mum had witnessed some of the violence and she basically gave me permission. She came down and said, you don't have to put up with this. We'll help you pack up your stuff. You can go and stay at your uncle's house and get out. And so at 23, to have that family support and that permission, that made it so much easier for me to leave.
You were lucky because back when I was going through it, everyone swept it under the carpet.
Did people know? Did they see it, or did they see
people
bruises?
Knew.
Or
everyone, my family, friends, people did know varying degrees of it. To be fair to them, I was very good at covering it up. I've talked to friends, obviously writing my book now, and they've said to me, we always thought you were the strong one and that you would handle it in your own time, and you gave us the impression you were handling it, you were going to your support group, this sort of stuff. So I really left without much support, and I think it was that, going back to what you said, knowing that I couldn't change him, the only person I could change was myself. And I then had to ask myself these questions. Do I like him? Not love him, I loved him. Do I like him? Like, really like him? Does he share the core values, goals, and beliefs that I have that are true to who I really am? Because I'd gone so far away from who I really was. I didn't even recognise myself anymore. And I thought, no, we don't have anything in common. I don't like him. I love him, but I don't like him as a friend. And I thought, what if he never changes? Can I unconditionally love him and accept him for who he is right now if he never changes? And secondly, is that good enough for me? Does that bring out the best in me? Do I bring out the best in him? Well, I look back one day at that relationship with regret. And when I answered myself really honestly, I thought, no. And even though I didn't want to leave because I still was addicted and I was being pulled back and it was like a junkie with heroin sitting in front of me and I just wanted a taste, all I wanted him to do was wrap his arms around me and say, it's going to be okay. Because I wanted us to be a family. I wanted him to be the father of my baby, you know. I knew I had to leave.
So you found the courage to finally go when your baby was a year old?
I had to plan how to leave very carefully and safely, because what happens is when you start to change yourself, they start to see it. And he started to see he was losing control of me. And that's a really dangerous time. That is when most people are killed, when they've said they're leaving or in the process of leaving, and when 75% of deaths and injuries occurs during that time. And I knew, because I felt the fear levels in me rising. I felt him becoming more on edge and volatile. So I planned my escape very, very safely. I found a safe haven. I set up the place where I was going to leave. And I then did a moonlight flip. I rang my friend and said, please help me. I'm terrified if he finds me. I've got to do this quickly. I knew he was going to be out for a number of hours, and I had no choice but to do it that way. And I just packed only what I could fit into the car and my baby, and I got out and I left everything else.
Wow, good for you.
Well, that's possessions. It was me and my baby now, and that was the most important thing.
Yeah, that's what's most important,
Yeah.
Exactly. Do you feel that many women actually don't make that move because A, they don't have the financial means to do it, B, they're afraid that they'll be stalked and killed and really unsafe, or C, they're just paralysed by fear?
I think it's all of the above. I think the paralysed by fear is I see that a lot, because now I'm writing in my blog every week and I'm doing videos on YouTube and stuff. I'm engaging with a lot of people and I'm seeing this a lot. The first step is the hardest, and that step to go, because it's full of a number of complications. You fear the unknown, you fear the future, you fear never ever seeing them ever again. It's really hurtful. You miss them, you feel lonely. I have people saying, it's too late for me, I'll never find love again. And you want closure. You desperately want closure that you're never going to get. You want them to say, yes, you did love me all those years. You were right. You did have my best interest, but you're never going to get that closure, sadly, with a narcissist who never takes responsibility for themselves anyway. I'm right, you're wrong. No, everyone else is to blame. You're not going to get that. So it's complicated with all of that. Then the financial is a very big issue. There's shame in Hong Kong particularly. Hong Kong is very backwards compared to, we're still pretty backwards in Australia and other places, but Hong Kong, it is still very shameful, it is still swept under the carpet, it's not talked about. And so there's a lot of that tied into it. And financial is a very big one as well, because there's financial abuse. I think there's some really frightening statistic now at the rising number of homeless, middle-class, middle-aged women because of abusive relationships, and they gave up their careers because they had wealthy husbands who then cut them off financially. But, countries are starting to get a little bit better about, I know in Australia that there are places you can go for financial funding. I hope that countries like Hong Kong can follow suit with that. But there are support lines, there are helplines, and there are places to go that can help you find that help.
And I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's not something that you have to do on your own, no. Even if it's a friend or an organisation or, there are definitely people out there that can help you, and you need to reach out and find them. And I guess you're doing that through your blog now, aren't you? Are you advising people?
Well, I would say to everybody, don't do it alone. You can't. It's too hard. I would say two things. The longer you're in an abusive relationship, whether it's emotional abuse or physical, the harder it is to get out. Because the longer you're there, the more you're exposed to that manipulation and that crushing of your self-esteem. Go and get help. There's plenty of helplines. I've got a weekly blog called beingunbeatable.com, and I'm getting amazing emails and comments from all over the world. And I worried that I would get a lot of people leaning on me as a counsellor because I'm not a trained psychologist or professional. But what I'm finding is I can be an adjunct to that. So where they really do need that, I'm the first to say, please get help and support. This is the helplines I've listed on my website. But I've been there. I know what you're going through, and I can talk you through all the steps that I went through and how I changed my life. And that's what they're all telling me. They're saying, I do get help in other ways, but the difference with you is that you're me. You've been through it. You know what I'm feeling and the pain I'm going through now when I'm leaving, and it's really, painful.
And that's so helpful, because even when you were talking about the characteristics of a violent situation, I could absolutely relate, and I just felt a real connection with you because we've been through a similar thing. And I think that there's so much we can learn about ourselves through this experience. What did you learn about yourself by going through this and coming out the other side?
Oh, wow. He was my greatest teacher of all. I don't regret that relationship, because what I've learnt is like Willy Wonka's secret ticket to life. It's fantastic. I learnt so much. I learnt, two things are the biggest things for me. One is that it's really quite simple. It's like Whitney Houston's song, The Greatest Love of All. If you can just find that self-love within you, then the rest will follow. Because you'll only attract the type of person who will treat you as you treat yourself. So if you feel unworthy, you will meet a person who treats you as unworthy. And if you've got very high self-esteem, well, then you'll be able to set healthy boundaries and say, no, that's not good enough for me. And you will walk away. You won't be one of those people who stay. You will walk away when you'll see those red flags, you'll see those warning signs, and you will heed your gut instincts because they will be strong. So that's the first thing. And the second thing was letting go. Because if by default you accept the things you can't change, which is everything and everyone else around you, and the only thing you can change is you, then it's really simple. You can just let everything in life go. And so long as you walk a very straight, honest line that's true to your core values, beliefs and goals, that is true to you being a good person and treating other people with respect and all that, then the rest will follow as well. Because those people who are the sort of narcissistic or whatever types, they'll start to steer away from you. And the ones who are good for you, that enhance your life, that you want in your life, you'll start to attract more of them. And you'll also become stiller. Because when you're not obsessing with fixing and changing everything and everyone else around you, you can just be still. And when you're still and trust that if I just walk that straight, honest line, the rest will come, then these little miracles appear. Because if you're so obsessed with, I've got to go that way, well, then the thing that's sort of telling you to go the other way, you're not even seeing it. So once I was still and just trusted, a person would come into my life and they would say something I needed to hear that changed the direction I was going, or an opportunity opened up that I never would have thought of before, that I was no longer frightened of walking through that door. If I have a bad experience in life, I'm not afraid of that either, because I feel that was meant to be.
We can learn a lot from our failures, can't we, or our bad experiences.
It's a mirror being held up to me, teaching me something more about myself. And if somebody's really abusive and bad, all I can change is me. Then I use this word responsibility. I've got the ability to respond how I choose. So you can take this into the workplace. If you've got a bully in the workplace who's bullying you and you don't feel comfortable and it's not acceptable behaviour, you don't have to defend yourself. You don't have to fight back. You can just be still and then just say to them, I'm sorry you feel that way. In other words, they can own their behaviour, nothing to do with you. I disagree. You don't have to get into any more argument than that. I disagree. I'm happy to discuss it, but only when you're prepared to calm down and speak to me in an adult fashion.
Perfect.
Simple as that.
Such great pearls of wisdom.
The ability to respond is another thing I've learned. Because when you're young and insecure like I was, you become a people pleaser. And you feel that you've got to please everybody. And you've got to always be liked. And now I don't worry about that so much, because the people who matter, they're fewer than when I wanted to people please with everybody, but they're the ones that matter, and they're the ones who bring out the best in me. And The ones that don't, well, if they don't like me, well, that's their problem.
I was the same in
and they're
many
entitled
ways.
to that too.
Yeah, wanting to be a fixer. I want to fix everything and solve everyone's problems and have this need to be needed, which really resonates with what you said earlier. Do you think that all abusers are narcissists?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's sort of what, from looking at your blog, you know, there's a lot about narcissism and abuse, and I wondered if you really feel that's linked.
You know why I do that? I mean, I never even heard the term when I was going through it. We never talked about narcissism.
No, and gaslighting didn't exist then
None
either.
of that.
Yeah.
And we didn't have the internet, so I had to work all this out, like you did, on my own, because we didn't have these resources. I don't actually know the answer to that question. I suggest that there's a very big element of that, but I know there's all these other things like many different sort of arrays of personality disorders. So I'm not an expert, so I don't know. A lot of the reason why I use that phrase is because it is so widely used on the internet that if I'm writing about that, then it's more likely a search engine's going to find me and I'm going to get my message to people.
And there would be a high percentage of people that are narcissists, certainly that are abusers, and definitely the gaslighters are narcissists, aren't they, I think?
Yeah, because a narcissist, by definition, I'm right, you're wrong, everyone else is to blame for my behaviour. I don't have any empathy. I need somebody else to be so empathetic that they'll come and rescue me and they'll take the blame. Thank you very much for everything that goes on in our relationship.
Do you know anything about gender roles in domestic violence and the percentages of women who abuse and men who abuse?
I don't have them to hand. I mean, the majority are men against women, and that's possibly just partly also culturally, as we're seeing with the whole Me Too movement, that, you know, this position of power quite often comes into it as well. But, you know, men are victims too. It's a much smaller percentage. The majority of murder victims are women. But let's not forget the men, because, you know, I met someone here in Hong Kong recently who is a lovely man and a very strong man, and he was in a relationship where he said, I was the victim of violence and she was 5'2" and I'm 6 foot. And he said, can you imagine the shame of me? And, you know, one of my relatives has confided in me that he's been the victim as well, and he feels shame about that as well. So men absolutely can be. And it also crosses sexual orientation, because I have gay men, gay women talking to me about their abusive relationships.
And the issue
and religious boundaries, it crosses all of them.
Sure, and that's sad, isn't it? That it's so prevalent. It's really just a shame. And this is why it's great that we're having these conversations, because hopefully we'll encourage people who are listening to speak up and get help, because nobody has to live in those situations.
The thing that shocked me the most, since I started writing my book about, it's been a 2-year process, and I'm just coming to the finishing stages of it, which I'm so excited about. But I've been doing my blog for a year, and I've been so blown away about how quickly that's taken off, but also so saddened. I knew what we're seeing as the tip of the iceberg, but I'm now realising the depth of this and how ubiquitous it is. It is everywhere, and it's worse than I imagined. Actually, the level of abuse, the level of violence I'm reading about, the level of really nasty battles that people are going through in court systems that are affecting and abusing children, because they are the unspoken victims in all of this as well. It just breaks my heart. That's why I just want to speak out, add my voice, and just say, you can get out and don't put up with it. You deserve better.
Yeah,
we
everyone
all deserve
better. Yeah, and there's a really wonderful, happy life to lead out there. You know, you don't have to be abused.
I was a single mother like you.
Yeah, we both are proof of that.
Went on to become a very well-known television producer, and still am, and I've had the most incredible life. And so it's just the courage to take that first step.
It is.
That's the hardest. Once you take the first step and get support, just keep putting one foot in front of the other, as hard as it is, and I know how hard it is. I felt like I was in the darkest of tunnels at times. There were times I couldn't even get through one day at a time. I'd go 1 hour at a time, 1 minute, and I was curled up fetal in a ball, just sobbing, and how am I going to get through this? But you can, and you just keep putting one foot in front of the other towards being a survivor and away from being a victim.
And how do you overcome that shame that we all carry, I feel, in those situations? How do you overcome that shame and move forward?
It took me a long time to deal with all my inner demons, and shame was one of them. I thought, why didn't I just leave? I could have walked out. And shame that, I came from this lovely middle-class family and, it's shameful. I'm not saying that's better than anyone who's not middle-class. We are all. But for some reason, that personally, I was embarrassed for people to find that dark, hidden secret that I had.
I felt embarrassed coming from a family where there was no violence.
Yes, I had
no violence, very loving parents, good role models, good, wonderful country upbringing in Australia.
Yeah.
And then went into this situation that was completely alien. And how did I not recognise that it was unacceptable, and why did I ignore the red flags? I mean, you've answered that earlier.
It's you, don't you? But all I'll say to anyone listening is you are not to blame.
And I think the shame can go with therapy and with talking about it, with getting support.
Build that inner void of shame and not feeling good enough and...
Yeah, building your self-esteem.
That starts to go away. It really
and time
starts to
helps as well, doesn't it?
And look, time is your best friend, and you can still get taken back like that. There might be something that knocks you back and you go back, but it's a journey. You go 10 steps forward, 20 back. And my journey's been ongoing, it still is. And writing this book has been another journey of just taking the onion layers off and peeling them away.
And how was it having to revisit the whole story in such depth so many years later to write your book? Were you traumatised?
It was really interesting, actually, because you can remember trauma really easily.
You feel it, don't you? You can feel it physically in your body. You can have those same reactions that you had at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I can go instantly back. So that was all the childhood stuff, because I had to, in a way, work out where that dysfunction came from in my childhood. And coming from a very happy, loving, wonderful home, albeit slightly dysfunctional, it's harder to remember when it's all great and lovely and fantastic than the traumatic stuff. So that took a lot of digging and a lot of reflection and a lot of self-analysis, I guess. And people say, was it cathartic? It wasn't cathartic in terms of my ex, because over the years I think I've worked so much on that. I've dealt with that and processed that. It was more looking at the family functions and how sort of even minor dysfunction affected me.
Can you share with me what you learned? Like, give me an example of what sort of minor dysfunctions affected you.
Look, I love my mum. She's the most wonderful woman, and a lot of my drive and success in television, I owe a lot to the traits that she's given me. But she also has narcissistic tendencies, and I realised that as I grew up, there was this sense of not being good enough. For example, she was always quite dominating and controlling, and if I questioned her behaviour and said it embarrassed me, say at school or something like that, I'd get told, you're too sensitive. Oh, you're too sensitive. Or if I disagreed with her, not even in an argument, just, about, even now if I have a different opinion about politics or whatever, I'll immediately get dismissed. And as a child, I'd get dismissed. Oh, no, this is why you're wrong, but I'm too busy to explain it now. And she'd slam the phone down. So it was just getting dismissed. It was getting my feelings dismissed. You're too sensitive. So if I felt emotions, they were dismissed. If I had opinions that were different, I was told I was wrong. Now, when you're a child, it's a bit like gaslighting, actually. When you're a child, your gut instincts are telling you that made me feel uncomfortable, but there's this adult telling me I'm wrong, feeling that way. That adult also happens to be my mother, therefore she has to be right, so my gut instincts are wrong. So over time, I numbed them and just stopped listening to them as I grew up, and the more that happened over time, you just dismiss them. And that's what happens in abusive relationships as well. Over time, you start to numb them because you start to not believe, because you're getting told all the time that you're wrong. So that's one example.
Well, that's really interesting. And did you make these connections as you were writing the book, or had you realised this throughout the last 20 years?
No, these ones started to really come as I was writing the book.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I always thought it was my father, because my father, he's a beautiful man. He came from a house of 4 girls. And I'm, one, and we're all the same. So 4 quite loud and outgoing girls, poor guy. And so he sort of retreated. But I think he was brought up with quite dominating mother. And she was a Jehovah's Witness and a quite dominating mother. And I think in a way...
So interesting, he chose a dominating wife.
And I thought that because he was emotionally distant, because I never really knew him when I was a kid, he was always there, present, in practical ways, but I never really connected emotionally with him. In a way, I thought, oh, I've married my father, this emotionally distant guy. But when I was writing the book, I realised that actually it's probably more the other way, that it's my mother who affected me more with that sort of dominating, controlling sort of behaviour and for what I've just described. And so that was a really interesting process.
So interesting, isn't it? And you can really then make the connections of why you moved on into this situation. Yeah,
and also, but what I did learn very, very early on, because there is things that I go into my book that I won't go into here now, but that I, at the time, really felt very upset about my mother in terms of the relationship and her knowing about what was going on. I realised very early on that you can love your parents, but you don't have to like everything about them. It's okay, that's not a betrayal. And in fact, part of becoming a healthy adult is seeing their flaws as well as their strengths and, taking what you like and leaving the rest, and then having that healthy cutting of the cord and reasserting your relationship back with them as adult to adult rather than parent to child. And I've done that now with my parents, and I've got a very lovely, close relationship with them, and yeah, it's great. And I don't blame them if they weren't there enough through the relationship either, because they were doing the best that they could at the time through the prism of what they were brought up in, and they were brought up very Victorian, that things like that would get swept under the carpet. It was shame, so...
Stiff upper lip, get on with it.
Yeah, and you just got to accept that it's not about blame anyone. Like, I don't blame them. I don't blame myself for being in that abusive relationship. It's about recognising where it comes from, finding where the roots of that low self-esteem and shame, sense of I'm not good enough come from, and then healing it. And once you heal it, then everything else will change.
Has the writing of the book been a healing process?
Very.
That's great.
Very.
And do you have any fears or shame or, about exposing yourself? And are you making yourself vulnerable? Yeah, I can imagine.
When I started my blog, the Daily Mail asked me to write this double-page feature article. Actually, I didn't realise it was a double-page feature. I thought I was just writing this one that was going to be tucked way at the back of the paper. And it came out, and it was this double-page spread with photos, and I was like, oh, my God. And it was the first time I told my story. And my friends, as I said, colleagues and friends didn't even know this about me. And I was like, my phone went off the hook as people were seeing this come up in the newspaper.
And what was the response?
I felt like I was walking down the street naked. And I'm so terrified because when the book comes out, it takes that to...
a whole nother level.
That blows it. Like, it is my entire life. It's when I lost my virginity. It's how I got... It's, oh, my God. I'm dying here. But I also feel so proud of myself because when I read the latest draft, I had some time off from it because my editor was going through it. And when I read the latest draft, I was reading it as a reader for the first time. And I cried. I cried for myself as a character, not for me as me.
Yeah.
I cried, and then I was there cheering myself on when I had those turning points of wisdom, and I was like, yes! And I just thought, this is going to help people. Because if they react the way I've reacted, I really hope they do, then me walking around naked will be worth it.
Oh, good for you.
I really hope it makes a difference, and that's why I'm doing it.
I think it will. I tried to buy it the other day on Amazon. I didn't realise it wasn't out. It's like, oh, I'll have to wait.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. What are your top tips for learning to love yourself?
Oh, I think you just look at the way healthy people behave. Number one, do something nice for yourself every day. That's the first thing. When you don't love yourself, and when I was going through hell trying to leave that relationship, I felt miserable and I didn't feel worthy of anything. I just started to do one nice thing for myself every day. Buy that dress you saw and you like. Go take an hour and just walk along the coast and take the dog into the sea and have a swim, have a bubble bath, whatever you want. Surround yourself with people who are going to bring out the best in you, not suck you and surround you with negative energy. Those people are energy suckers. It doesn't matter if they don't like you, let them go.
Completely. You're so right.
You know what I love? Do you remember Bridget Jones?
Yeah.
The first movie?
Yeah.
And they have that punch-up, and it's Darcy and Daniel Cleaver punch, it's raining man, hallelujah, and they're punching, and they end up in the cave, and they end up on the street, and then she's got to choose between Cleaver and Darcy, and she goes to Daniel Cleaver, Hugh Grant, and she holds his head in his arms, and as he comes round, he looks at her, and she says, "We belong together, Bridge, you, me, and your little skirt." And she then has that light bulb moment where she realises that he's an arsehole, excuse me.
Yeah.
And she says, "I'm sorry, that's not a good enough offer for me." I use that in my life all the time now. So what I would say is ask yourself that question all the time. And it could be a relationship, it could be a new job, it could be a new friend that you're with. Are they good enough for me? Is this good enough for me? What I mean by that is, are they bringing out the best in you? Are you bringing out the best in them? Do they make you laugh? Are they something that is close to your true values, goals, beliefs, and who you really are? And if not, move on.
Brilliant. Oh, that's great.
But surrounding yourself with those people who are really, good for you is a very important one. Then other ones about healthy boundaries.
Yeah, setting boundaries is so important, isn't it?
It is the most important thing, actually. Just
know what's acceptable to you and what's not, and stick to it.
Work out what they are.
And that's what I didn't do when I was young. I didn't set boundaries. I didn't know about boundaries. And
the hardest word I've ever learnt in my life to learn was the word no.
Especially when you're a people pleaser.
Yeah, when you're a people pleaser, you just say yes, 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 because you want to please everyone and you don't want to not be liked. And the first time I said no, I was terrified. I was shaking. It was an office situation and I was being bullied, and I had to sort of stand my ground. But it doesn't mean you have to be aggressive. You can say no in a very calm, healthy way. And the first time you say no, it's the most liberating moment of your life, because then you realise that bullies are cowards.
Yeah.
And they melt and they go away. And
it's not that difficult to say no, is it?
Yeah. And then the next time it gets easier and your life will improve because of it.
And one of the other things I wanted to ask you about was negative self-talk.
Oh, God, I was the expert in that.
So was I. And what's your advice for overcoming negative self-talk and stopping it? We're almost conditioned to do it, especially now with the media and social media and, everything that's surrounding us. It's becoming harder and harder and more prevalent just to accept our flaws and accept who we are.
It really is. When I was young, I had this inner voice that would just go, "Why did you say that, you idiot? What did you do that? You're a fool." And it was unrelenting. It would just bash me daily.
Well, it causes anxiety, doesn't it?
It really does, and that's why I people please, because I think, oh, what are they thinking of me? They think I'm an idiot. They think I'm stupid. And it was, the more you build your self-esteem, the better you get at it. But what I would say is it's just a story you tell yourself. And so the story I told myself was I wasn't good enough. I wasn't lovable. And I think part of that came from my mum, that sort of stuff that I described earlier. But it's just a story. It doesn't mean it's true. And it's a bit like that dress that went round virally on the internet where some people saw it as blue and
black.
That's it. And the other people saw it as white and gold. It's perception. And you can change that perception. Again, it comes back to self-esteem and self-worth. And once you change that perception and really start to work on the fact that you are lovable, you do deserve better, then you can change that perception. And once you change that perception about you, you will find that other people will start to treat you differently.
They'll respond to that change, won't they?
Yeah, people treat you the way you see yourself. I get taken aback. I wrote a blog post recently where I went to this event and it was a lot of younger women and they all looked really sassy and fantastic. And I had one of those days where, Hong Kong, you get your hair's frizzy as hell.
And you're huge.
Yeah, and I just felt that I was middle-aged and unattractive and frumpy and frizzy hair and all these girls looked so fabulous. And I got into the lift that day and I just felt like a frump. And this beautiful young girl looked at me and just said, "You're really beautiful, And I went, there's one of those people, when you need the answer, the teacher appears. And I just hugged her. I said, "Thank you so much for that. I really needed to hear that today." And somebody took a photo of me on that day. And months later, I came across that photo and I thought, wow, I really looked nice that day. And I thought, that girl was right. I really did look beautiful that day. And I thought, wow, that was a big lesson again. Even now I can get taken aback that was my perception in my head that I looked frumpy and ugly. Because when I looked at the photo, it's like younger people. You are never as fat as you think you are. When you look back at yourself on those insecure times, it's just perception.
Yeah, we can all see that now. Perception. I was so critical of myself in my 20s and my 30s, and I look back now and I was like, oh my God, you're amazing. And now I'm like, oh, I'm getting old. And then when I'm 70, I'll look back at 50 and I'll be like, hey, you were great.
So now that's what I'm determined to think, that, I'm going to stop looking at these bingo wings. And we've got to focus on the positives. And actually just say, I look great today at my age, because when I'm 70, I'm going to look back and go, why didn't you appreciate that back then?
Totally. We've got to learn something as we're moving through this world,
so
don't we?
Change your perception. That's all it is. You can rewrite your story.
Beautiful. Before we go, Viv, can you just tell me, how can people get in touch with you and find your blog, and how can they get your book, and when will it be out?
My blog is www.beingunbeatable.com. So beingunbeatable.com. And I'm on YouTube as Unbeatable or Being Unbeatable. So the handles will be at Unbeatable or at Being Unbeatable. And I write there, I put videos on there every single week.
Your blog's fantastic. I really read through it and had a great look to develop my questions for meeting you. So it was really good. You're a great writer.
So there's lots and lots of free stuff on there, every week that people can benefit from. I've got a closed Facebook group called Unbeatable, and that is where lots of people who've done my online video courses are in there. People just wanting support that want it confidentially. I'm in there a lot giving advice and tips, so I've got that secret Facebook group as well. And my book will be coming out this year. I don't have the exact date, but hopefully around May this year. And I will be blasting to the hilltops on my website
when
about
it's out.
That.
Great.
And also, if you go on my website, there's a little quiz you can do, a free online quiz, which is my relationship good enough? And it will just look at whether, your relationship's good enough, whether your self-esteem is high or not. And it's a fun little quiz that you can try for free as well.
Awesome. And finally, if somebody listening to this is questioning whether they're in a relationship that is unhealthy for them or abusive, what's the first thing that they should do?
I would, number one, trust your instincts. If you are feeling that you are, then you probably are. And then I would get help and support. I've got a lot of domestic violence resources listed, free helplines, anonymous helplines that they can call. So if they go onto my website, it's under domestic violence resources. You can find helplines there.
Perfect. And I'll also leave the number for the Samaritans in Hong Kong where they can ring and get support there as well. Viv, thank you so much for meeting with me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I actually feel like I've had therapy, so thank you for the free therapy. And I hope our listeners out there have really got something beautiful out of it as well. It's been really inspiring and really beautiful, and my heart feels very full from meeting you. So thank you so much.
It's been such a pleasure, and it's been amazing having somebody who knows and has been through what I've been through.
Yeah, it's great. It's very special because of that reason, because I do know what you've been through.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Viv.
Thanks again.
Awesome. Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with us again next week. If you enjoyed today's show, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review us? We would really appreciate your feedback. Email me at juliehannaford@hotmail.com if you would like to comment on this podcast, or if you have any ideas that you would like to share. You can also hit me up on Twitter at Jules Hannaford. Also, check out my Facebook page at Hong Kong Confidential. I'd love to hear from you.